30, 10, 50, 40, 10, 50, 20,
We start with more legal heat on Donald Trump. Shocker. The January 6th committee saying more witnesses have come forward since the bombshell testimony exposing Trump for fueling the violent coup. More on this in a moment. A rattled Trump will now have his allegiance tested from some of his closest allies. Breaking today, Rudy Giuliani and Senator Lindsey Graham have been subpoenaed by the Georgia criminal investigation, the grand jury probing Trump's election interference. Also subpoenaed, the coup mastermind, John Eastman, the Trump campaign lawyer, Jenna Ellis. The jury believes Giuliani, quote, possesses unique knowledge concerning communications between himself, former President Trump, and the Trump campaign. The January 6th committee also hammering Trump's pressure on Georgia Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes. A criminal probe witness who testified to the grand jury will join us here on The Beat exclusively. The January 6th committee eyeing the role extremist groups played in the insurrection. The next public hearing will focus on ties between these groups and Trump world. Roger Stone was spotted with Proud Boys on January 6th outside the Willard Hotel, the so-called Legion of Doom insurrection headquarters. And the star witness revealed Mark Meadows wanted to go as well.
Is it your understanding that Mr. Giuliani, Mr. Eastman, and others had set up what has been called, quote, a war room at the Willard Hotel on the night of the 5th?
I was aware of that the night of the 5th.
And do you know if Mr. Meadows ever intended to go to the Willard Hotel on the night of the 5th?
Mr. Meadows had a conversation with me where he wanted me to work with Secret Service on a movement from the White House to the Willard Hotel so he could attend the meeting or meetings with Mr. Giuliani and his associates in the war room.
Now more witnesses are coming forward to the panel and teasing more explosive evidence is to come.
This happens every day. Every day we get new people that come forward and say, hey, I didn't think maybe this piece of a story that I knew was important, but now that you guys are, like, I do see this plays in here.
Will we hear from witnesses that you did not know about, with stories you did not hear because of the hearing so far?
Yes, yes. There will be way more information, and stay tuned.
I know sometimes you hear Trump is rattled, but seriously, he's rattled. This is how we know. Trump is eyeing an early presidential run announcement, quote, designed in part to shield the former president from a stream of damaging revelations. That would mean he can't use $100 million in PAC money for whatever he wants. The clear sign here is he's worried about prosecution. Conservative lawyers say he'll be indicted. And now, if he announces a run early, he can say the prosecution is political. Mayor Garland, the ball will be in your court. Hope you can shoot. Joining me now is Howard Dean, former DNC chair and governor of Vermont, and Dania Perry, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York and former deputy attorney general for the state of New York. Dania, I'll start with you. I'm fascinated by what we're seeing happening down in Georgia right now. I want to jump to the end of this because, again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. But it seems to me that if the president and his friends and his buddies and members of his campaign are going down to a state, asking for votes, asking for additional information, putting pressure on people, that does seem to be some sort of election interference. What would be the legal consequences if the former president, was found guilty of federal election interference in the state of Georgia?
So it would be the DA in Fulton County, Fani Willis, is investigating state law violations of election interference and interference with official proceedings. So that is distinct from potential federal charges. And clearly antennas have gone up of law enforcement at state, local, and federal levels. Her investigation, again, is different, separate, and apart from any investigation that the Department of Justice may or may not be conducting. We hear rumors and rumbles, but the DA there doesn't have the same kind of political and prudential considerations that AG Merrick Garland certainly does. And so she's a little more free from any of this politicization that we do see the Department of Justice concerning itself with. You know, there, of course, Garland has famously expressed, and we also, you know, just see from observing that he is trying to depoliticize this, trying to not to look at this through a political lens. Of course, you know, you can bend over backwards so far that you do a complete flip and it becomes political to not investigate or not prosecute. But Fani Willis does not have those same concerns. And so she seems to be looking at this very seriously, certainly seems to be keyed in to the witness testimony coming out of the January 6th committee, and is very focused on some of these witnesses who are going to push back, and they're gonna scream and yell about attorney-client privilege. At the end of the day, I think it's likely that judges will find, in the same way that a federal district court judge did already in California with respect to John Eastman, that the attorney-client privilege does not apply where there is evidence of a fraud. So the crime, fraud, or other crimes. So the crime, fraud exception very well may come into play here and allow the testimony of these witnesses.
Governor Dean, I want to talk about how we're sort of getting these witnesses and how the public is putting this together. So there are 2 more January 6 hearings. I don't know why there's only 2. I think we should have January 6 hearings all the way up until November. I'm not doing the programming, but we've got at least 2 right now. What do you think the public needs to see in these next 2 hearings? We know the next one's going to be talking about connections to the Proud Boys. What are some things that you definitely think the public needs to hear in these next 2 hearings to absolutely solidify the case, to not just make it clear that the previous president was fomenting a coup, but basically to delegitimize anyone who is remotely connected with him and still wants to defend his big lie?
Well, we're not talking about huge majorities of people who haven't already decided what they think of Donald Trump. The issue and why Georgia is so important from a political point of view, it's a critical swing state, and there's a Senate seat up that could be potentially quite competitive that the Democrats need to win. I think we are going to win it. But I think that big damage has already been done to Trump. I think the most horrifying thing for the American public is the January 6th footage of people assaulting the Capitol and killing and 4 people dying as a result of that, including a police officer. So I think the damage has already been done. Trump will blather on about his guilt and the committee and all that stuff. It's pretty impressive when you see Liz Cheney up there, who's, you know, pretty smart, and she is just laying waste to Trump and his people. So there's 35% or 30% of people who are going to support Trump, even if he is a dictator and an authoritarian. They kind of want an authoritarian government. But I think an enormous amount of damage has been done already in the court of public opinion. I think that's unlikely to change. And I do think some of his people eventually will be convicted. You cannot call the Secretary of State and say, find me 11,700 votes and expect that not to be the subject of a grand jury inquiry and most likely a trial.
Daniel, speaking of Liz Cheney, I want to play some sound from the Congresswoman talking about what they think some of the results are going to be of this January 6th committee. Once all concluded, and get your thoughts on the other side.
We'll make a decision as a committee about it.
So it's possible there will be a criminal referral, which would be effectively the committee saying that he should be prosecuted, and this is the evidence that we've uncovered.
The Justice Department doesn't have to wait for the committee to make the decision.
You Maybe it ends up being
از ساعت دیروز ساعت 7 تا الان باز فقط یه سر میزن هیچ خاموش نکرد.
basically unchecked power when it comes to organising federal that sounds familiar. That might be because it was part of the groundwork for the Trump campaign's brazen attempt to overturn the 2020 election result. Trump lawyer John Eastman tried to argue that the so-called independent state legislature theory gave state lawmakers the power to throw out the result. Back then, his arguments were laughed out of court. But a fringe version of it has actually been around for a while. Then Chief Justice William Rehnquist nodded to this weird radical idea in his concurrence for Bush v. Gore, the case that decided the 2000 presidential election. From the highest court in the land. Should take up the matter. Could be gutted come 2024. Where do you stand on that?
So the idea that legislatures could throw out votes that are already cast is a warped variant of the theory that the Supreme Court is being asked to adopt in this case. Technically, the issue in Moore versus Harper is whether other institutions within the state, like state courts, can protect voting rights before an election occurs. It would be another issue, a separate case, whether state legislatures have such plenary control over elections that they could throw out votes that have already been cast. Now, obviously, these theories are related, both rest on the idea that state legislatures have total, unchecked plenary authority, but they are distinct issues. One is about whether other institutions within the state can protect voting rights before an election has occurred, and the other is about whether state legislatures have such plenary control they can ignore the votes that have already been cast once an election is underway or has occurred.
I guess having lived in the United States for the past 7 years, I'm always going to assume the worst variant is what's going to happen. Adam, you wrote recently about the court in the Atlantic. You said, quote, "The current majority's approach is itself a kind of undead constitutionalism, one in which the dictates of the Constitution retrospectively shift with whatever Fox News happens to be furious about. Legal outcomes preferred by today's American right conveniently turn out to be what the Founding Fathers wanted all along." And I guess we're seeing this across the board. We saw Clarence Thomas the other day invoke some weird QAnon-ish conspiracy theory about fetuses when it comes to the COVID vaccines in a ruling. We're now seeing justices bring forward this debunked, it's not even a theory, this idea that state legislatures can throw out votes. They really are just following a kind of right-wing media echo chamber script.
Well, I think it's unquestionable that the media that the justices consume shapes their perception of constitutional issues. I mean, in this case is almost, I mean, it's a little reductive to say the question is democracy constitutional? But to some extent, that's really what we're talking about here. You know, if the point of democracy is that the voters can change their mind. And what happens every few years is we have, you know, parties try to gerrymander themselves into electoral proof majorities. And sometimes the courts say, no, you can't do that. And this is essentially, you know, the definition of one man, one vote, one time, in the sense that what these legislatures are trying to do is trying to say, you know, we can entrench ourselves in power, election-proof ourselves from the voters so they can never change their minds, and then remain in power forever. And that defeats the entire purpose of democracy, which is that people can change their minds, they can decide to throw the bums out. And what is happening here with this case is essentially an argument that the Constitution prevents. In my view, it is essentially an argument that the Constitution prevents voters from picking their government, which defeats the entire purpose of our system of government, even as it hides itself behind the cloak of constitutionalism. It's really absurd. But it is an example of what you were just talking about, which is just this sort of imbibing of the most radical elements or radical arguments that float across right-wing media. The justices imbibe this stuff, and to some extent, they take it seriously. They don't always, but sometimes they do, and it has serious consequences.
I mean, gerrymandering itself is fundamentally anti-democratic in my view. And this idea that state legislatures can then use the majorities they've created through gerrymandering to keep themselves in power is outrageous on so many levels.
Perpetual.
Leah, let me ask you this. You're a law professor. I do not envy your job right now, teaching students about our system, about the great ideals of the American separation of powers, about a court that is theoretically neutral and independent and non-partisan and non-political, which is all BS, I'm sorry to say right now. I mean, this fringe theory, as you mentioned, came up in Bush v. Gore in 2000. Bush v. Gore is where Brett Kavanaugh was arguing on behalf of the Bush team. Amy Coney Barrett, I believe, was doing research in Florida. And John Roberts was giving advice to Jeb Bush, the then governor of Florida. Wonder where all three ended up 22 years later. I mean, the whole idea of this court not being political seems to be the biggest, like the most weird thing that we're expected to carry on believing. How do you teach that right now?
No apologies are necessary. You know, I think it is important for people to learn more about the Supreme Court, because the more that they learn about it, the more they will be informed about what role it is actually playing in our constitutional system. I think it is completely right that this current Supreme Court is just discarding well-established precedents, is ignoring constitutional text, is ignoring the text of statutes in order to advance the Republican Party's agenda. And they're doing that in part because these lawyers were cultivated, you know, within the conservative legal movement. They worked on behalf of the Bush campaign. And of course, it's no coincidence that the Supreme Court is about to adopt an argument pressed by the Bush campaign after three of the Bush campaign's lawyers, you know, are on the Supreme Court, or three of the lawyers working with the kind of Bush circles are on the Supreme Court. So I think it is as important a moment as ever for people to learn a lot about what the Supreme Court is doing now and what the Supreme Court has done over the last 200 years, so that they can, you know, increasingly have a voice in what they think the role of the Supreme Court should be in our constitutional democracy, because it's certainly not the one that it is occupying now.
Indeed, and Adam, it depends. We need Democrats to come out and say this, to question the court and not simply be institutionalists who defer to whatever a rogue court does, and yet
has failed to have a plan for our economy, for our country. He should take the blame, as well as the Chancellor. And listen, I actually accept what you're saying. It isn't just about Boris Johnson. It's about all of them. And I think the Conservative Party has failed the country. One of the things we found in the by-election victories that we've had over the last year, whether it's in True Blue Buckinghamshire, Cheshire Hampshire a year ago, or before Christmas in North Shropshire, a seat the Tories have held for 200 years, or now most recently in Devon, lots of lifelong Conservatives feel they've been taken for granted. They feel
in what way?
Well, they feel they're ignored, they've been taken for fools, they don't feel they're getting help with the cost of living crisis, they don't feel that the NHS is getting the type of
So it's not
investment.
about the antics of the Prime Minister, then?
It's partly. Yeah, no, fair dues. I mean, some people really didn't like the Prime Minister. My point is, it's not just about that. And, you know, they should get rid of him, let's hope they do, but that won't solve all their problems. I think there are some Conservatives who think, oh, let's get rid of him and then they'll be all right. Well, they've got to deliver for the country. And they've got to have a package which is going to help people. Liberal Democrats have been putting forward our package. One of the reasons I think we've been winning these by-elections. We know we've talked about the need to have a VAT cut, because that will not just give people help with reduced taxes, but it will also cut the cost of living and help small businesses struggling on the high street. So we've got a real well-developed plan, actually, and the government doesn't seem to have that. And Tory voters sense that. They sense that there's no direction.
OK, what's your prediction for what's going to happen to this Prime Minister, how long he's going to last? We've had varying views this morning, including from Chris Bryant, who likened it to a hotel toaster. That's a long story. I won't go into that. What do you think?
Do you know what? I'm going to be a bit humble, I don't know, because I tried to call it a few months ago, because I thought they'd get rid of him months ago. And I said to some people, I don't know, I think it must have been before Christmas, he'll go before Christmas, and he didn't. So I'll be honest with you, I got it wrong, because I don't think the Conservative Party seems to be clear. They seem so divided, they seem incapable of doing what I think the country desperately want them to do. Because, you know, if he does go, there is a chance, at least, there might be some decent strategy put together, and that's in the country's interest. And we've got an economic crisis, we've got a global security crisis, the climate crisis, we've got so many problems, and it's almost like they've been, you know, making it up as they go along. And
seems unfair to criticise him on the world stage, though, because, you know, he seems to be very well received. And the UK president often speaks very fondly of the support, and he names him, that Boris Johnson and ergo the British government has offered to his country. Yeah,
let's be clear, it's been cross-party support for the way Britain has helped President Zelensky and the Ukrainians, and we've absolutely been clear that. Liberal Democrats have argued, if anything, for them to go further on things like sanctions and support for the refugees. But if you talk to other presidents, I mean, listen to what President Biden, the US president, you know, our closest ally, they're not that keen on Boris Johnson, particularly about how they deal with the Northern Irish Protocol, for example. So I don't think he is as respected. And I was talking to some French politicians last week. They feel that because he's broken the law by reneging on treaties that he himself signed, that he himself, Boris Johnson, said was a good deal, they feel that is quite damaging the reputation of our country. So I accept what you say about President Zelensky, but I think it's a cross-party support for Ukraine. In other areas of foreign policy, he's making a real mess.
Well, you say about President Biden, I mean, frankly, it's not up to President Biden who runs our country. It's up to the people of the UK, absolutely. And that is only during a general election. And he has a mandate for another 2 years, and he has a majority not quite of 80 anymore, thanks to what some of you guys have been doing on the ground. But he does still have a thumping majority. And, you know, I think, was it David Cameron who referred to him as a slippery piglet?
Well, it was interesting to see the Daily Mail front page talking about being a greasy piglet. But listen, I don't want to go there. What I want to talk about is what really is in the country's interest. And you're right, he has a big majority. We can all count. However, what we felt from people who voted for him at the last election, whether it was in Cheshire, Amersham, North Shropshire or Tiverton and Honiton, or indeed the local elections, which were across the whole United Kingdom, people who were backing Boris Johnson, a lot of them are saying no longer. And they cannot believe that the Conservative Party are still behind him. And, you know, OK, people are resigning now, but why weren't they resigning months ago?
Do you know what you're going to ask him at PMQs today?
I probably won't get a question at this PMQs. I know what I'd like to ask him, which is...
Go on then, take the opportunity.
Why are you still here?
That'll do it. It's great to see you, Sir Ed, as always. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. Thank you. What does the Shadow Chancellor think?
When people go to the polls, they are voting Labour, and they are voting Labour in bigger numbers than we have had for well over a decade now. I say bring on that general election. I want to see Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. I want that chance to be a number 11.
But he lets the Prime Minister wriggle off the hook every Prime Minister's questions, is the general view of what's happening.
But when voters go to the polls, Kay, they are voting Labour in larger numbers than they have for well over a decade now. So, you know, when voters have that choice between Labour and the Conservatives, they're rejecting the Conservatives, rejecting this Prime Minister, rejecting this government, and looking again to Labour.
Now, Sir Roger Gale, you know, has not hidden his views as far as the Prime Minister is concerned of what he wants to see happen to him. He was on the show again this morning. This is what he said.
The man who wields the knife, or the woman who wields the knife, is virtually certain not to get the job.
Not true, though, is it? I mean, I was thinking about that. Isn't that what people like Boris Johnson did to Theresa May? Isn't that what we saw with Maggie Thatcher and Ted Heath? Isn't that what we saw with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair?
They didn't wield the knife. They got other people to wield it for them. And I think there is. I mean, that's what a clever person does. You know, I have a preference for knifing people in the front, but there are plenty of people in the party who knife people in the back.
Somebody else who potentially has knifed the Prime Minister in the front is Conservative MP Andrew Morrison, who quit as a trade envoy yesterday with There's No High. Why did you quit?
Well, it's been a long burn for me, Kay. I've been deeply unhappy for some considerable time. I suppose the straw that broke the camel's back yesterday was the letter written by Lord MacDonald, who was the senior civil servant at the Foreign Office when I was there, to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, which I think laid bare the relationship that the Prime Minister has with the truth, which is something we'd known for some while. But yesterday, I think, actually just made it explicit.
It basically said that the Prime Minister was lying.
Correct, that's what it said.
OK. We've known that the Prime Minister has a loose affinity with the truth on more than one occasion previously, so why now?
Well, it's been a long burn. I suppose you could argue that many of us perhaps should have gone before now. But changing Prime Minister is a significant thing. It's not something we do lightly. And the Prime Minister has achieved a lot, I think, in his time of office, which is in anticipation of which is why we supported him in the first place. But to be honest, you know, enough is enough, which is why I resigned yesterday, and two very senior cabinet ministers, I imagine, probably decided that they had had enough too.
In your opinion, what has he achieved during his tenure?
Well, I supported him because, if you recall, in 2019, we had to deal with Brexit. It was acting like a sheet anchor on our politics and on our country. And it seemed to me that Boris was the only personality that could drive that through, and he has done so.
Has he? Is it fixed?
I think it probably is, as an ex-Northern Ireland minister and chairman of the Northern Ireland Select Committee. And, of course, Northern Ireland is the main sticking point in this and always was going to be.
I was going to say Northern Ireland might say that it's not yet fixed.
Well, Northern Ireland may well say that, and I fully understand that position. But the fact is, I think, for the most part, Brexit has been done, it's been achieved, but we have to deal with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Clearly, that's unfinished business.
OK. Did you vote against him during the recent vote of no confidence?
I did.
Why didn't you leave then?
It's a very good question. I could quite happily have done so. I'm an arch loyalist. That's my instinct all the time. And I certainly support the government. I support what the government is trying to do. And I think it is a time for unity for my party. I don't think that unity is going to be possible under Boris Johnson, which is why I've come to the conclusion that I have.
What do you want the 1922 committee to do?
Well, there are two ways of moving forward, aren't there? In the immediate future, more resignations, ministerial resignations, I think might force the issue. That would be the quickest way of dealing with it. If that doesn't work, then the backbenchers are going to have another go. 148 is a big number. It wasn't enough, but I think a rule change is appropriate. Indeed, I think we're obliged to consider a rule change.
OK. Not at the moment, because that isn't going to happen unless they change the rules for the rule change. And that's what Boris Johnson has been criticised for many times in the past, changing the rules when it doesn't suit him.
Look, this is the 1922 rules are of a different order. We have to have a mechanism, a safety mechanism, for dealing with a Prime Minister who is clearly not fit for purpose. I think we have a duty to change the rules because we can't leave this until June next year.
What can he do to convince you otherwise?
He can't, and I've made that very clear in my letter to him, and indeed he's made it clear himself in that he said last week he can't change, he's not going to change.
Do you not feel that you had a responsibility as trade envoy to continue on with the work that you were doing, holding the UK in a good light to, I think it was Morocco, wasn't it?
Yeah, Morocco is very important to me. I've got a long-standing relationship with Morocco, and certainly my work there is not done. I will continue it by other means. You can be sure of that. But it wasn't a decision I took lightly, because being a trade envoy is a fairly junior position, but it was important to me, and I really wanted to keep it because I think we're making progress there. But sometimes in politics, you've got to take a stand. I think your integrity depends upon it, which is why I acted as I did.
So tell me about that process from when you first thought, I'm not sure about this Prime Minister, to actually penning the letter.
Well, as I said to you, it's been a long burn for me, and it's accumulation of a whole load of things. It's not Partygate, important though Partygate is, and desperately awful though it was. It simply wasn't just that. It's a whole raft of issues around the Prime Minister's character, his relationship.
I was thinking about your emotion, how you were feeling.
Oh, deeply gutted. I mean, really gutted to do that. I'm not a quitter. I'm an arch loyalist. If you look at my 20-year record as a Member of Parliament, I've always been loyal. So this is completely contrary to my character, which is why it's so difficult for me.
Nazim Zahawi on the programme this morning, the new Chancellor, saying he's completely confident that the Prime Minister has integrity.
OK, well, I think everybody's got to speak for themselves. I respect Nadeem very much indeed. I hope he's able to hold things together. I imagine his narrative will be that he is there to try and hold things together, and I wish him luck in his new appointment.
Would he be a good Prime Minister?
I'm certainly not going to be drawn on successors to Boris Johnson. I believe that Boris needs to go now. He needs to salvage what dignity he can from this process now, but he needs to go nevertheless.
How does he salvage dignity, in your opinion?
He needs to go now without dragging this out. He can't be dragged out of number 10. That'll look awful. You know, we're a sophisticated country. We're not a banana republic. We don't have people clinging on when they've lost all support among their colleagues in the country. In the past, what's happened is people in the position that Boris now finds himself in just stand at the podium outside number 10 and say, look, it's been a great honour to serve, but my time is up, and I hope he does that.
Those are very strong words, aren't they? You must feel very, very passionate about what you're saying.
I don't do things lightly. I certainly don't resign lightly. I feel strongly that the time has come for Boris Johnson to go.
What would you say to other ministers, junior ministers or cabinet ministers in a similar position to you?
I would say to them, it's for them to make up their own minds on this matter. Those of them who have leadership aspirations need to be very careful, however, because backbench colleagues like me will be taking note of how they position themselves. And if they remain in office, they are vicariously liable for the Prime Minister. So I'm afraid they are going to be associated with what he does. And we cannot complain about Keir Starmer and point out to the public, as we really should be doing, that he served for all those years under Jeremy Corbyn, if at the same time there are people who are prepared to stay in office supporting Boris Johnson.
What is the gossip in the tea rooms over the last 24 hours?
Well, I'm certainly not going to divulge conversations in the tea room. It's tea room in confidence, as it were. But I think the mood among my colleagues in general is fevered, and a sense that this is certainly the beginning of the end. This has a sense of inevitability about it. With any other leader in our history, it certainly would be curtains. But Boris is a particular sort of individual, which is why this is dragging out for so long.
So do you expect more resignations?
I would be very surprised if there aren't more resignations.
Today?
Could be today, could be later this week.
OK. And just a quick thought. We had Sir Roger Gale on the programme this morning. He says could limp on until the autumn, the Prime Minister. Your thoughts on that?
Well, there are two scenarios. One, we have a deluge of ministerial resignations and the position simply becomes unsustainable, even for somebody of the tenacity of Boris Johnson, in which case it'll be game over very soon. Or we have to have another go at through the 1922 process, in which case I think Roger is correct. This is going to be an autumn job.
It's great to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We do appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, earlier on the programme, I actually spoke to Boris Johnson's former press secretary, Will Walden, and asked him what he would say to the Prime Minister if he called for advice. This was his reaction.
Very, very unlikely. What would I say to him? I think Boris stopped listening to me a long time ago. I don't think there's any way you can spin this now. I think probably deep down he knows that. It seems that to me that he's been busted once too often in the job. And I think part of the problem is he had no strategy, no clear ideology. He's been buffeted, of course, by events. He's had three teams around him of different iterations who all seem to have one thing in common, and that's the inability to stand up to the Prime Minister and just say, stop. Sorry, let's just game this out. If on a Friday you suggest that you never knew about this, what happens for some reason if you did know about it and on Monday we have to reverse ferret? And it seems to me that over the years there's been nobody there who's been really, really clear with him, which just says, it can't go on like that. That is not a strategy for running this country. And I think as Mayor of London, he was like the perfect salesman. He was the perfect presidential kind of candidate over the water with no opposition and no Conservative Party to have to run. Running a government and running the Conservative Party is a very, very different job. And much as it pains me, he hasn't listened to advice, or he's not been given the right advice. And he's made the same choices that he made as mayor, but they've been proven wanting in the bigger job of being Prime Minister.
Don't look away, because there's another one gone. Just hearing from Robin Walker, Worcestershire MP. I have today offered my resignation from the government and look forward to supporting the Conservatives and campaigning for Worcester from the backbenches. It has been a privilege to work to support our brilliant schools. Tamara, another one bites the dust.
Another one bites the dust, Kay. They are really coming thick and fast now. Robin Walker, the schools minister, he is more senior than Will Quince and Laura Trott, who we had earlier, so the most senior of the day. And he had previously been a minister in the Northern Ireland office, working on difficult issues such as the Northern Ireland Protocol. This is again middle-ranking junior ministers getting